teams debating here for making it this far in what is a really competitive NUDC. That is really a great feat. In the panel of judges, my name is Upi. I will be your chair judge for the round. It's an honor. I'd like to invite my panelists to introduce themselves from, let's do right to left. So we'll start with Icha.
Hi everyone, my name is Anisha Listasha from Universitas Mataram. You can refer to me as one of the panelists. Best of luck.
Hi everyone, I'm Nayara from Erlangga. Good luck everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Matthew. I'm one of the panelists. Good luck to everyone and let's have fun.
Hello, Satwika. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Jose. Good luck for the semifinals.
Hi, I'm William from PIA. All the best.
All right, wonderful. Since this is a multi-person panel, we'd like to ask all speakers to please refer to us as a collective. So panel or members of the House would be great. So nothing like Mr. Speaker or Chair, because that would be individualizing. So we would be preferred to be addressed as a collective at all times, just because we're equal. The other things in terms of housekeeping is that speeches will be 7 minutes. Less than that is completely fine, but please do not exceed 7:15, just because no further notes shall be taken after 7:15, so please bear that in mind. I believe that somebody will be timing, so please refer to that as well, and if you need a timer in the podium, feel free to ask one of the liaison officers for that. POIs, very important, so please take that note because that could really affect the levels of engagement. So you are really encouraged to offer POIs to the opposing bench as well as take at least one POI per speech. That would be great. Yeah, just to be very relevant to World University standards. And finally, this room will be live streamed, so yeah, just be cognizant of that because there will be audience that are watching not just here in this room in person, but also online. And also, please use the microphone at all times, especially when you're speaking. There will be a mic right there in front of you. Feel free to adjust that before you start your speech. And when you're offering POIs as well and you're asking the question, it's 15 seconds, but also please use the microphone. Okay? Great. Any questions before we start? Wonderful. In that case, we're going to be talking about grief. I would like to encourage trigger warnings if there is anything that is sensitive and use tact and all the equity rules when it comes to just making sure speeches are not triggering but still is within the burden of the motion and what is need to be discussed. So don't be afraid or hesitate to talk about anything that is relevant that you think is important. Okay? All right. In that case, then I'm wishing everybody the very best of luck and may the odds be in your favor. And without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to speak and open the debate. Hear her.
There's no timer, yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so couple of things as opening government wants to establish for this entire debate to be able to go smoothly. Number one, grief is not going to be accumulative, or it's not going to be accumulative in the way that it adds up to the point where people cannot function, right? Because we say that under our side of the house, even though grief is lifelong, it will still make people get used to it easier, right? Because when you feel one thing, it's going to make you, it's going to prepare you, it's going to make you do it again. For example, if you break a glass one time, yes, you might feel sad, but the 10th time you do it, you're probably going to be like, okay, another cleanup, right? I mean, that shows you how grief is going to manifest in our world. Number two, grief is not only about death, right? We want to clarify this for every single part of the house. Grief is about loss. So what does this loss look like? It can look like a divorce. It can look like you losing a job. It can look like, or example, you losing a family member. So grief is not just about death, right? That is what we want to pursue, and that is the clarification that we want to make. And onto my points. Number one, grief makes us do things, right? Grief is what pushes us to do certain things. Because grief is not just death, and grief manifests in a way where it causes regret. But we're going to explain why this regret is good and why it's going to cause better effect in the long run under our side of the house when it manifests for lifelong, because it shows us what to do in order to further avoid it in the future, right? So first point, evaluation. First layer, grief is not just death. It's an emotion felt when you lose someone. For example, when you lose something, for example, marriage. What does this cause? It causes our most important point, which is self-evaluation. Look at people with like 5 wives, right? For example, they have a first divorce, and then what happens with this? They feel grief, they better themselves, they marry again, and then because they marry again, because they are happy, because that grief disappears, it subsides, they revert to their old personality, right? Because they feel that grief is not there anymore. So what this causes is that they get married, and then again, and then like they did change, but they revert back, and then they get divorced again, right? And this just continues in a cycle until like the 4th marriage or the 5th marriage, and it's not good for anyone in this case because it's just on practicality. That's how we manifest it, right? Another practicality benefit is that we want to continue those that you grieve. So this is in the case of loss or, for example, divorce or those that you lose, right? This lifelong grief is going to make that happen. How will that manifest in our world, right? Because, for example, you mourn your mother. Your mother has taken care of your siblings your entire life. Your mother did this, 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 and this. So because of this lifelong grief, you're going to most likely to continue these principles for your lifelong thing. Because what happens on the opponent side of the house, for example, right? Because when you have this grief subside, you're less likely to continue it because of selfish reasons. Like, for example, you have to take care of your siblings. But, for example, you got like this really hot girlfriend or partner or something, and you say, maybe that's more important, even though, because the grief has subsided and you don't really have anything. Because the grief has subsided and you don't really have that regret that is pushing you anymore. And why is this likely to happen? Why is this likely to happen with only good principles? Because grief changes your principles into those you mourn, and it's likely to be the good principles because that's what you remember from those you mourn, right? You're not likely to remember like the bad principles. Like, for example, my mom like used to drink a lot. You're not gonna start drinking in your mom's memory, right? No, that's not what's gonna happen. And people are going to actually follow the good examples, right? So what is this good? This is already our argument on practicality, and shows that it's actually better on our side of the house in practicality purposes to help people like care more about those who are still alive and to help people improve themselves. And on to principle, is this morally right? Is this morally right to make people feel grief for their entire life? Yes, we say that this is morally correct because we have a moral obligation to be able to feel this grief towards others, and this grief should last as long as we are alive, right? Because of the fact that, because number one, the simple reason that, for example, these people are dead forever, so come on. And the second reason is like, for example, like let's take the example of how this manifests into the real world and how this principle will actually benefit in practicality motions. For example, let's take, for example, like the victims of the Holocaust, right? This grief towards the victims of the Holocaust is what caused people to still visit these museums, caused people to still watch these movies and feel sad for these victims, because we have, and this is correct, because we have a moral obligation to care about these people that were affected by the tragedies that we as humans have conducted in the past, right? Or for example, let's say like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Because of the grief that we feel towards these, we are much more inclined to constantly remember what happened in these historical events. So yes, so we connect grief to not only this, but also to in an extension to memory, right? So we already fulfilled the obligation of principle, right? So what we have shown you that like, we have shown you how grief makes us do things. It pushes us to not only be better because it causes a sense of regret, but also it causes us to care for those around us, because when we lose something, we are more likely to take the good things from something we lose. Like for example, when you lose a marriage, you're more likely to take the good parts of the marriage and manifest it into your next marriage, right? And this needs to last forever, right? This needs to last for your entire life, because when on opposition side of the house, when it subsides, it's not going to be good. Before that, any POI?
How do people process grief on your side?
People process grief like this, right? When people feel a loss, they're going to process grief in a way where, I already explained, number one, they're going to remember the things that they are grieving, and they're going to continue that memory. They're going to continue the principles. That's number one. And number two, how people process grief, obviously is going to be different for every person, right? But we already established that it's not going to be accumulative. People are eventually going to get used to grief, and grief is going to become a status quo. Because it's very important to establish that neither of these sides are status quo, right? Because in current status quo, grief doesn't completely subside, but it's also not completely lifelong, right? Because it also depends on every person. So opposition cannot use status quo for their argument, right? They have to create another world, just like we have. So why is this important? It's because that in status quo, grief is something that everyone will eventually experience and everyone will eventually use in order to grow themselves, in order to actually feel fulfilled within the lives they're in because of the reasons I've given. And because of the principal obligation in order to feel grief towards those that we have lost. Because of the fact that, within the principal argument, what you remember about these people is what will continue, and that will also continue to others, right? That will also continue to, for example, the people that mourn you, which is good because it's going to create the grief is not going to be accumulative on you, but it's going to be accumulative to generations because of the fact that you self-improve yourself. So when people mourn you, they're going to also take your principles, your good principles, and remember that and continue it, right? So why is it important to be lifelong? It's because people need to continue these for the entire lives in order for the cycle to continue, in order for when people mourn you, then you still have those principles that you are mourning from the thing that you are grieving, right? On their side of the house, when it subsides, it's not only going to cause problems, but it's also like they cannot argue about the sadness argument. You can't argue with the moral argument because we already show you that this grief actually causes us to do what we are morally obligated to do as humans, as people who care about other people, as people who have been part of the species that have committed so many atrocities. Proud to propose.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for those very fine remarks. To start the case in the opposition side of the House, I'd like to invite the Honorable Leader of Opposition to speak. Hear, hear.
I'm gonna start my speech in three. Oh. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so first, before going to this debate, I think there is some things that we should clarify first. Like, in status quo, there is already a narrative of subsided, but people can still process it lifelong, right? They can choose whatever, they can go lifelong process, or they can do the subside, but right. But we do recommend them to do this emotional state that one day will subside. So all of the benefit of this lifelong process that golf has bring will also manifest on our side, right? It is not mutually exclusive for this small marginal of people. But we will prove to you why in the larger scale, why in the society, in the narrative, that it will be better on our side, right? So first, we are going to prove to you why status quo is enough, and I'm going to respond to their cases first. They said that this grief won't be accumulative, right? I think first we have to characterize how human process emotion in the first place, right? You cannot say that grief won't be accumulative because when you break, for example, break octo, and then you break semifinal, and then you break all of those things will be accumulative, right? You will be very happy and happy and happy and happier, right? So their claims of grief won't be accumulative is untrue, right, in the first place. But even if it won't be accumulative, and yeah, it will be the same all the time in lifelong process, I will explain to you in my case why it is worse on their side. So then, they also come to you that it is morally correct to do these things. It is to commemorate the people, to come to the, for example, the example is the Holocaust or the library, for example, and etc. Right? We think that it already happens in the status quo anyway, right? That people still commemorate people, even if their emotional state subside, right? Because the important thing to do here is that they doesn't understand that if this emotional state subside, they will still remember, right? Because it is two different things. When you remember someone, or when you process a respect for loss for someone, right? So then, OG entire case already falls in this debate. So then, let's come to my debate. Let's come to my arguments, right? how it will be better on our side when this is a narrative in a larger scale, right? First, the emotional state that one day will subside creates a narrative in the people, right? It gives people this hope, right? It gives the people this that, oh, one day it will pass, right? On our side, it will be more reachable, right? It will be on the shorter term when comparatively on their side, it will be long term, right? Why is this important? Because as I said before, emotion is something that is accumulative, right? If you don't process this in a shorter time, or if you don't process it for the correct amount of time, then you won't even be able to do things rationally, right? When on their side, when it's more accumulative, then it will be harder on them, right? They will have, for example, more mental breakdowns or some other things, and those things are what actually undermines their benefits of self-evaluation, or most likely to do good things from the loss of the people, right? So those things will actually manifest better on our side, right? Because when you can process this loss faster, when you can process this faster and move on, you will be more likely to think more rationally, right? You will think that, oh, what is good from the people that I lose, right? You will, for example, remember that, oh, she is a good mother, she is a good father, and I should internalize it on me, right? Because the process of internalizing and the process of grieving itself is a different thing, right? Which I will explain later. So then, why? What is the other layer for this? Is that human always have a feeling that takes up most of our life, and how we will express it on most of our lives, right? For example, when you wake up in the morning feeling very bad, feeling very stressful, for example, it will lead to all your entire day, right? And we may concede that you will still feel good, but those feelings are still on our side, right? So if you have a feeling, if you already have a determined feeling from the day that you wake up, for example, such as the feeling of that grief that they will prove, it means that you will feel sad, you will feel angry, for example, from the start of your day, right? And yeah, this will translate badly to your life. This will translate badly when you integrate it with your daily life, right? The most ideal scenario is that you feel neutral, right? You feel that, oh yeah, I'm gonna process today with just what is going on today, right? And those things are what makes you a functional human being, right? In the community, in the society, right? Because if you cannot function properly, it will of course affect your livelihood too. It will of course affect your social life too. It will affect everything on your life, right? So the importance of moving on is there. So then it comes to my second argument, right? The practicalities of how people will cope with this. If they know that this is something that will subside, if they know that this is something that is an emotional state, we think we are sure that they are more likely. It is more likely for them to just, yeah, I think I should do the process very big in the first time and not the long run. So proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the Leader of Opposition for those very fine remarks. To continue and conclude opening government's case, I would like to now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver their remarks. Hear, hear.
for the timer. The phone is dead, by the way. As emotional human being, our emotion is what dictates us to make action. The social justice movements like Black Lives Matter is born out of the grief of the passing of George Floyd. Under their side, because this grief will eventually be gone, I don't think there's any urgency for people to take an action to make this kind of social justice movement. So this is what we're trying to avoid under the opening government. But here's the thing, when we're talking about like the strong narrative of like the grief will subside, I think here's how like people experience the pain and mourn, but then they will not do anything, they will not bother do anything, because under their side, the narrative is that, okay, your grief will be gone. So like why bother taking action? You can simply listen to sad songs and be depressed and so on, but then the feeling will eventually be gone. So under their side, there is no even any incentive for you to make an action, to take self-evaluation, and this is very harmful. But why is that so? Because under our side, we believe that there will be better character development when people take this grief as a lifelong process. Number one, because grief is inevitable. Even under their side, when they're trying to champion, okay, this grief is very cumulative, it could be very devastating and so on, we think that even if they're going to make an instant illusion in which, okay, the grief is gone as fast as possible, this will be an unsustainable illusion under their side, because eventually when the second grief happens, if you mourn like your grandmother passing away, and then like, okay, the feelings subside. Under their side, when your grandpa passed away, you'll feel the same regret, but under our side, because of the mourn of the lifelong process, you regret not spending time with your grandma, therefore you'll have a better incentive to spend time with your grandpa, therefore creating a less degree of grief under our side. Because when we were telling you that the degree of grief will be much lower under our side, it's because of the self-evaluation and character development that will happen once you perceive this as a lifelong process. When you barely spend time with your grandma and mourn her passing, now because you grieve it, you will see it as something like a valuable lesson. So if you regret not spending time with your grandma and you mourn that your grandma is passing away right now, the feeling of regret, the deep mourn, full time to process this, is better under our side, because when you try to remove this emotion as fast as possible, I think the full process of grieving, to self-evaluation will not happen under their side. So there's no incentive for you to spend more time with your parents. Therefore, if your parents one day grow old and eventually pass away, under their side, you have the same amount of regret, you have the same amount of mourn, the very feeling of pain and suffering will be even greater under their side. But here's the thing, when you're talking about perceiving grief itself as something that will eventually subside, not only that it will degrade the value of grief itself, it is principally wrong, because when you're trying to the very reason why grief subsiding is so harmful is that it removes the incentive of self-evaluation, because you know the pain will be eventually gone without you doing anything. What does it look like? So you have no feeling of regret once you do something wrong, once you experience the grief. Like my prime minister that I told you before, okay, if a guy grieves about losing their job, he will listen to sad songs and so on, but okay, this feeling of grief will be gone. I don't need to evaluate myself. I don't need to do anything better under myself. So there's no incentive for them to do this kind of action. But when we're talking about why is it justified then? Even if the grief is cumulative and could be very devastating, we believe that extreme grief will result into extreme self-evaluation. Even if it will generate trauma, we argue that this trauma is what will protect these vulnerable actors from encountering that same exact grief. How does it look like? If I lost my loved ones in a car accident because I don't wear my seatbelt and so on, under their side, okay, you grieve, but the feeling will be gone. Under our side, when you live in this constant trauma and regret of not wearing seatbelt and so on, you will avoid this kind of accident. So under their side, this kind of exact mourn and grief and trauma, a traumatic experience would most likely still happen because of the lack of self-evaluation. So even if trauma and devastating experience is going to happen under our side, we believe it is principally right and it is justified. But yes, before that,
An emotional state is something that can fade and come back, so we can quote-unquote choose when we want to grieve. Example, only when you are visiting your grandma and etc. And it is different from remembering and self-evaluation.
Okay, if you're talking about emotional grief being able to like come and go, because under your side, the narrative that it will subside. So what's the point of remembering it again? What's the point of experiencing it again? So like, I think this is a half-stand statement coming from the LO, because like when they're trying to say that, okay, the benefit of lifelong process is not mutually exclusive under our side, this is a world reset motion, meaning that these two principles cannot coexist. But not only that, even if the people, like when you're trying to say that people will still commemorate even if emotional states subside, I think the commemoration under their side is not even as powerful under our side. Because okay, you will grieve for once, but then like, because the feeling of pain is gone, you see it as a normal event. The passing of George Floyd, the passing of like this constant black figures that are oppressed by the majority will be seen as something that will, okay, we are sad about it, it will pass, it will eventually be gone. Why is this harmful? Because under their side, we believe there is no incentive for any social justice movement to even happen in the first place. Because the cumulative feeling, the way we're oppressed constantly, when you're trying to, like if they're trying to argue that people will be constantly sad and mad under our side, number one, it's not like very true, but number two, even if that's the case, we say that, we argue that it will be okay, because if people are not constantly mad about the oppressor, about the discrimination that they're experiencing, there is no incentive for any social justice movement that would happen under their side. So if you're not constantly mad about the oppression of black people, the Black Lives Matter movement will not happen under the first place. If you're not constantly mad about the government, there will be no university students taking demonstrations under their side, because okay, the feeling of oppressed, the feeling of grief, being oppressed and so on, being discriminated will be gone. It will subside eventually. So this narrative is very harmful. Not only that it will discourage people to take action, but it will make like less incentive for people to regret it, because okay, it will be gone eventually. But not only that, because when you try to like champion the whole concept of like people need hope and so on, it gives people the hope like the suffering will be over. Not only was it an unsustainable illusion, because under your side you cannot prove that okay, the faster it is, the grief will be gone. I think not only that the people will not be able to fully process it, because the whole point of grieving is not about how fast can you process it, it's about how deep you can learn from the grieving experience. So like if your mother passed away, it's not about how fast can you move on, it's about how deep you actually care about the sentiment and legacy of your parents. It's about how deep you can evaluate yourself to prove to them, to make them proud of yourself, to make them happy, to regret, okay, I'm not spending enough time with them, I've been ignoring them, I've been not obedient to them. This is the self-evaluation we're trying to champion under our side, because any grief should not be repeatable, and we don't want this to happen again under our side. Therefore, proud to propose and proud to be in semifinals.
All right, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister for those very fine remarks. And to close opening opposition's case as well as the opening debate as a whole, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to speak and deliver their remarks. Hear, hear.
Tas. Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One important characterization to set us apart from opening government and solidify our win for the opening bench is the fact that they've never characterized to you what exactly goes into grieving in the very first place. That's why several POI has been made by my leader of opposition saying that grieving and remembering people are inherently two different things. Grieving is the process of going through the 5 stages: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. If you cannot defend how it has to be felt throughout my entire life, not knowing which stage of grief I will be in for my entire life, life, then you cannot win this debate. But let's respond to your case one by one and solidify our win even further, right, panels? They talk about how grief is what makes people remember, etc. We've already clarified to you that grieving and remembering is not the same thing. You can be out of the grieving stages and remember your loved ones in the very first place. I still remember my grandma even when I'm no longer grieving her, making the benefit of remembering not exclusive, but also better on our side. Since when you remember the people on our side, you remember the memories of that person, the lifelong lessons that you take away from that person without the overbearing sadness, anger, denial, bargaining that happens with the grief in itself, right? There's no likelihood on how, when exactly people grieve for their entire life on their side, they'll exactly take only the good things or the good points of the grief in itself. I grieved the ex who ghosted me. It left me with two things. One, he's a bad partner, period. But two, glad it happened because it shaped me. The conclusion that I came to, the peace that happened to me, is because I can confidently say that I've moved on from him in the very first place. That I don't have to go through the emotional turmoil my entire life of getting ghosted and him leaving me with abandonment issues. That is exactly why the whole concept of it being subsided one day is so important to give hope for the people exactly grieving in the very first place, because they are the most vulnerable actor that we're trying to defend on both sides, right, panels? But exactly, they say that, oh yeah, self-evaluation happens because of the grief is lifelong, right, panels? Panels, self-evaluation happens with grief, period. It doesn't matter how long it takes. They have to defend to you how, when it's suddenly lifelong, it's exactly better on their side, right, panels? I've grieved my grandma. I've moved on from her death. I strive to spend more time with the elders in my family because I know that they will meet the same fate as her one day. But the conclusion of that entire process can only happen when I look at my grieving process from a third-person point of view, that I've acknowledged that it has passed and now that I can do better in my life in the very first place, and I can exactly undo my wrongdoings that I've made my elders exactly, right, panels? They also brought up a really huge burden on social justice and how it won't happen on our side. This is untrue, panels. Remembering people, what happens in a lot of ways. Remembering 911 doesn't have to happen via grieving in the very first place. I can just not go through the 5 detrimental stages of grief, but still remember the tragedy in its entirety, remembering the lives that were lost, etc., proving that social justice will still happen because it happens on a lot of spectrum, not only grieving, it's not the exclusive way the entire case falls. Let's clean up the debate for opening so closing cannot steal anything from us. What does it look like exactly to grieve someone, panels? It looks like going through the 5 stages of grief that I've already mentioned: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. The process is important because of the tangible outcome from it, panels. When you grieve, you have to have the feeling or hope that you will eventually move on from that grief in the very first place. This is not present in OG because there's no tangible likelihood of whether or not you will move on in the very first place, panels. That is why the entire narrative of it being able to subside one day is so important to give hope in the very first place later. Hope that one day, whatever I'm feeling will subside gives me more hope to exactly continue with my life. Being able to move on is so important when I'm going through such a detrimental grief. Not only is the grief from relationship, but also exactly more detrimental griefs like death, or exactly my parents' failing marriage, or whatever. The hope that it will someday pass is so important. So I will bring to you my extension. Why is human perception exactly that important in the very first place? What is human perception, panels? I can lose right now in semis, but my perception will determine how I react and cope with it. I can either go out with a bang and say, oh yeah, I made it to the semifinals of NUDC, or I can go out exactly with another bang to my mental health. Oh no, I only made it to semifinals of NUDC. This is how important perception is in the very first place. When I lose someone, how I perceive it on how I will move on will be on my mind, and this is the only thing on my mind. 2 questions that comes up on both sides, right? 1, will I ever be able to move on? But 2, when can I safely say I'm in the state where I am literally okay and have moved on in the very first place before I continue any further with my case? Yes, the POI.
Okay, so people will be forced to move on because it will subside. People will force themselves to move on so quickly, and they won't be able to process it properly, which makes grief more accumulative on your side, because when they don't process the first one properly, the second one won't be processed properly either. And when it hits at the same time, it's going to be worse.
I don't know how it's mutually exclusive. When I properly grieve one grief at a time, suddenly the other grievances would not be grieved properly. Just because I lost my grandma and I've grieved her properly doesn't mean that somehow on my grandpa's side I'll grieve him less because I've grieved my grandma. Grieving is is innate to somebody. It varies from relationship to relationship on how significant it is in the very first place. So if they want to champion how it'll be the same for every single relationship, that's a big burden to prove and cannot happen on their side, right? What does it look like exactly then on our side? You believe that it's just an emotional state, an undetermined period of time, since people grieving states are different, right, panels? But a belief that one day it'll get better or pass is what's needed for the people grieving in the very first place, because they need exactly the hope that whatever I lost will somehow be okay with me in the very first place. Whatever relationship I lose, that I can still live and move forward, because there are other relationships to strive for, to look out for, and that I cannot have or cannot process if I still grieve over the ones that I've already lost in the very first place. It puts me in a cycle of constantly remembering the ones in a bad light, with so much anger, sadness, bargaining, and not being able to move on with my life in the very first place. So what is exactly the outcome of the perception, and why it's better on opening opposition? Society's narrative on what should be proper when you grieve is going to be so judgmental on opening government. On their side, you have people going, oh, so you've moved on. That is like so quick, since they're your grandma. There's a constant pressure of remembering the bad things that exactly happened to you, the detrimental losses that happened to you, and it should be a lifelong process. That means I cannot be fulfilled with myself and my stage of grief, because society will always tell me that I have to grieve longer and for my entire life in the very first place. But on our side, it'll go like, see, I told you, it'll exactly pass one day. You're exactly better now. These are the type of hopes that cannot be tangible on their side. The feeling of whether or not you can strive from this incredible loss that you've already went through is so tangible on our side, and you can actually see the outcome, because the moving on, the one day that it'll get better is so championed on our side. It gives hope to the people grieving. It gives hope to the fact that you can move on with your life even without that person in the very first place. Our world will be better for the people grieving. That is all for my speech. Thank you.
All right, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for those very fine remarks, and that's the end of the opening half. Now moving on to the second half of the debate, the closing half, and we'd like to ask the Member of Government to speak and open that half. Hear.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Why we have Roderick Sibrani Award? Because we want to always remember Kak Odi as someone special. Remember that everyone want to be remembered for all of their dedication in this world. Show to this world we have meaningful person that we need to tell our generation, because they will always remember in our lifetime. But let's talk about the process of grief. Firstly, you will try to hate in that situation, cannot to accept it. This is why the big case of opposition, it's like people cannot to move on. But secondly, you also nostalgic the beautiful memory that you have done with that person. But before that, what the delta between the government and the opposition? Because in the opposition, it's just an emotional state that one day will subside. It means you can feel the grief in the beginning, but you will lose long process the way you meaning that person as an important part of your life. Be your role model, also the reason why you still doing the good things like what the person do in the past. This is something better that characterized coming from OG, that people in the opposition, they talk that you will never get this kind of like sadness and etc. So it's simplistic. Biggest case of OG is grief make you have evaluation, achieve your own personality, doing self-evaluation so you can be a better person. But the problem is, first, Why when you feel long sadness, it can suddenly become an evaluation in their side? I think they have a huge hole in their biggest case. But secondly, why lifelong process can suddenly make social movement happen quickly in their side? Because the answer just we need to remember because their answer just like you need to remember the operation. Let me give the answer that be better than and be the prerequisite of their case. A, we have sacrifice concept as a virtue in this world. People like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela want to remember as a good person, as a person that really contribute in this world. This is why lifelong of process really important to achieve Gandhi and Nelson Mandela objective of their sacrifice. But B, we feel sad when people take an action for their community but you not. This is the reason why sadness coming from grief help you to more empathic and be what human beings should do in our side of the house. Let's talk about OO. Biggest case of OO, the process to grief is take a long time and it's hard for you to move on. But OG cannot to tackle it. So let me give you a 5 complete reason. Firstly, the biggest question for OO, why your life in your world looks like a competition? When you need to do anything for competitive things without validating your emotion first, your life is your life. This is exactly the reason why the word is bad, because you make people become forget to concern the emotion. We don't want to make it as a competition. Your grieving is meaningful. You processing emotion with someone that's really important in your life. But secondly, move on is a situation when you can deal with the situation. But the process of move on in their side will be dangerous because it will create intellectualization of emotion, because you try to push grief as something that you don't need to think in a lifelong process. It works like you will empty, but you don't know what happened with you. It happened because you make grief as something that easily gone just for move on, so you will stepping process including like denial, anger, depression, beginning, and acceptance. B, thirdly, lifelong process in our side, it means we want them to fully understand their feelings or their experience in the process. So you fully processing your emotion without jumping anything. I know that maybe to achieve the acceptance level, it will be really hard because maybe you will get sadness in a long process, but it's fully okay because we want sadness get validated, not just an unnecessary emotion that stopped in your word of in the side of in your word in the opposition. But fourthly, what the difference between two words? It's how the society will react with this grief. Most likely in this side, you're not considering other people grief as something that important, because that people will move on as soon as possible. It means you will not give much emotional support even they feel grief. This is why struggle in the beginning of grief will really worse in the side, because you not help them in the moment they really need your help, but you make a word for them to forget it, so jumpy and not validate their feeling. So this is really insensitive in the side of the house. But fifthly, in the worst case, even they not achieve their acceptance, believe me, lifelong process in our side, it means you will more concerned with your emotion. You feel it. This is something that people always forget to do until they cannot until in this side people cannot to identify and control their emotion. It means in our side, concern make you believe that instant action like being alcoholic, for example, not solve your solution because you just repeat the unnecessary cycle. I just remember what Khairil said in semifinal of KDMI last year. When he lost his father, he feels the sadness, but the concern to his emotion make he get a goal to standing as a gold medalist in LDBI and KDMI, because he want make his father proud and be a good protection for his mom. It proven to you why a word with grief as a long life process. It means we validate human emotion, don't want lie and just forgetting that emotion, and be people that be too logical until you not have a process to concerning your emotion. This is why our case is a really important. But before that, silakan Oi.
How is an emotional state somehow translate to as soon as possible?
Because at the end of the day, I have proven to you why in the side of the day they still achieving the grief, but it will really easily to forget in the side of the house. But what the harm for that condition? Because at the end of the day, it's make the people in the opposition side become more suffering, because they cannot to adapt with another grief in the future. Like you get a shock when you have a grief, but and then it's gone, and then when the another grief happen to you, you will shock again, and etc. So at the end of the day, it's just accumulating the bad process in your life, which is like you cannot to deal with it, but you just like just to save it, give intellectualization of emotion, and then you just try it as a cycle that never been ending, never achieve the ending in the side of the house. This is why at the end of the day, in the opposition side, they will feel empty like what I said. This is why at the end of the day, in this side, they cannot to adapt with the situation, and this is why at the end of the day, in this side, you cannot to achieve the real happiness in the side of the house, because the prerequisite of the rational and real happiness is when you can get a proper definition about all of the things in this world is not permanent. So you need to normalize it that you maybe have a bad moment in your life, and then you need to because in our side we can to get a better concern about our emotion. It means in our side you can to believe that okay, I have not permanent things, but it's not something that we need to value it, but it's not something that we need to make it as a reason why we cannot to move on to continue our life. Because at the end of the day we learn about how we can to solve that solve that problem. But at the end of the day it's better because when you get happiness, for example, you can like remembering the person in the past, like wow, I have experienced it with this person, so it's make you feel the nostalgic. And the nostalgic is the most important things in our side, because nostalgic is free. You cannot to pay anything about nostalgic. Nostalgic make you believe that your world is not that sad. You make it's make you believe that your world you still have a happy moment that you need to remember. For example like Audi, or for example like the father of the for Kairil. And this is the reason why at the end of the day the grief that happened in our side, it means that we are more empathic about our life. We are validating our emotion, so we can continue our life better because we can fully doing the step of the grief itself. So this is why we are propose this motion. Thank you.
All right, I thank Member of Government for those very fine remarks. Now moving on to the first closing opposition speaker, I'd like to invite the Member of Opposition to speak. Here.
Trigger warning, I'll be talking about death, about grief, and things that may be hitting close to home. So if I offend you in any way, I'm very sorry. That's not my intention, it's just for the debate in itself. First, let's kick out CG and OG out of this debate if we can explain to you that remembrance can still exist and the appreciation on our side still exists anyway. Things like CG said, oh, we remember Kak Odi because we grieve for him at the end of the day. I don't know Kak Odi, right? But I respect him very much because he paved the way for Indonesia to be able to go to WUDC and be recognized by the world at the end of the day, right? It shows to you that the pragmatic benefits that they give, things like Nelson Mandela and those other stuff, or like Albert Einstein, those pragmatic benefits is the thing that makes you remember another person, not the grief in itself. And then, moving on to OG, right? They said that, oh, it's not accumulative, people can get used to it. We question this because like how, when you do not move on in the very first place, for example, things like your grandma died, for example, and then your grandpa died, but you haven't moved on from your grandma, and then on top of that, you haven't moved on from your grandpa anyway, right? So at the end of the day, it's all cumulative on their side. So that means the entire benefit on your side doesn't even exist, right? I think what is lacking in the opening debate in itself, like what OO said, like, oh, you want to remember people, but CO is going to explain to you better with the thing, okay, later. CO is going to tell you that we are not only going to remember a person, like what OO wants, but we are going to make those memories more significant, and we are going to remember those memories in a much greater light, right? But firstly, on how grief is, right? Grief is hard. Grief is something that is so sudden, you have no control over it. No one wants harm to happen to them. No one wants the people around them to die. You can talk to someone one day and the next day they could no longer be in this world. Or when your father abandons you and left you alone with your single mom, right? Those are the things that isn't in your control inherently. So it is morally unjustified for you to do so. Don't buy into OG's case. What does lifelong process on their side looks like, right? Firstly, being in a constant state of grief. grief. A, you feel sad to validate the fact that you care for a certain person because you internalize that stopping your grieving and living the rest of your life is a sin, and you should remember the grief for the rest of your life in order for you to remember them, or else there would not be any significance in their life at all. I think this is very bad, right? Because the people that have died or an event that has already occurred has already been done, right? Not only this is principally unjust because you are not asked to lose someone or a bad thing happens to you, this also then disallows you to live your life to the fullest for the rest of your life, right? And secondly, it is not a moral obligation for you to be in constant state of grief, right? Grief or like constant grief at the end of the day is involuntary. You have no control over death. You can control whether you win or lose in NUDC, for example. You do your best in your life so that you won't regret it. So the thing that they say like, oh, I will not be grateful for my grandpa because like I will already be moving on from my grandma won't even exist, because I know that my grandpa will one day die as well, so I would still love him as much as I could. Yes.
Grief can still happen even if you don't know the person. I don't know a person, but I still grieve them especially because of the others that are grieving around me.
That is not grieving, that's sympathy, okay? So if you want remembrance on your side, the way that you remember someone would look like, one, the last memory of them dying, or the last single moment that you didn't break in NUDC, for example. The horror when your parents divorce, the constant grieving that happens on your side will only perpetuate the bad image of grief in your life, which is the last image that is always going to be seen for with you for the rest of your life, right? That depiction in itself, this allows you to live your life to the fullest, right? Secondly, on our side, when you know the feeling subside in itself, you will remember the good memories to help you move on, right? Things like, oh, I lost my grandma, but I remember that she cared for me, she cared for my mom. She's such a caring person, and I need to move on, and I know that she wants me to move on, right? To live my life and to carry on her legacy or those stuff, for example. This shows to you that on government side, you remember these memories, it will only be in a constant state of grief. When you remember that your grandma braided your hair, now you remember that, oh, my grandma can no longer braid my hair. Those type of stuff, for example, right? Thus, what do we want on the side of CO that is going to be very different from side of OO, right? Firstly, on closure, security. I know you're sad. Things like saying, I know you're sad, but it will be okay. Portrayal of grief is like, it will be more prominent on our side. The portrayal of how to cope with grief in itself and how much support that you will have from the people around you will also be bigger on our side. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, grief will always happen, even if you know that you can't move on. On government side, you say it's not cumulative, but you will remember one person in your life that died, and then another person died, so you don't have those benefits at the end of the day. Secondly, it shocks people. Drastic changes to your life happen suddenly. One day your grandma is cooking you breakfast, and one day she fell sick, and she can no longer do those things to you, right? Which shows to you that if it's a lifelong process, it disallows you to actually feel the brighter things in life, to actually see what people are actually is going to be there for you, right? But then engaging again to OO, they say that like, oh, if one person gets divorced, remarried, and get divorced again, this is a vicious cycle. So on your side, people are simply not allowed to continue their life. That is very weird, right? Morally unjust. Where's the moral principle in that? And how is it justified at the very first place? Oh my God, it's so bad for the living to continue living. Goodness, how dare you move on? This is the world that they are going to live in. That it is going to be better than OO because it's the internalization from you, not the shaming, because it's a world reset motion, right? Like the motion states. So this is something that government has a fiat, but we are more charitable to it. Things like, NGOs and those other stuff on OG will exist. This is inexclusive. Actions are driven by sympathy, not grief. If it's driven by grief on your side, the people that are less attached to the grief won't even do anything. It is because it's the obligation of the state, for example, NGOs doing those things because they want to protect the vulnerable people at the end of the day. It is inherent with the care of the people. And then they say that like, there would be no feelings of regret and no feelings of those other stuff. But I think that grief and trauma, processing a memory still exists. Things like being careful when you ever fall down a bike, for example, still happen. There's no rational thing that would disappear just because you suddenly, the grief subsides, right, in itself. The outcome in itself that I've already explained is firstly, you have a better life for you to continue living without the feeling of guilt that you can live the rest of your life when someone stops when they die, right? It's, for example, like someone is already dead, for example, or someone has, or an event has already moved on, for example, but the fact that you can't continue living in itself is such a morally unjust thing to do. But on practicality, you can better nurture people around you that are still alive. Things like grief that makes you turn to alcohol, drugs, or shutting themselves in will be even more validated on opposition, because on your side, everyone does it. I mean, when it means on our side there's urgency for people to move on, there's an urgency for people to stop those habits and actually nurture the people around you. Vote for CO.
All right, thank you, Member of Opposition, for those very fine remarks. Now, we'd like to move on to the last government side of the House speaker, and that would be Government Whip. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Grandpa, this one is for you. This motion is a comparison motion between which way of perceiving grief could create a better world for society collectively, and will it be better for people to see it as a lifelong process or as an emotional state? A little bit of context of how our side is different from our opening. First, although we do agree that OG has presented you with some good valid points and comparison analysis towards opposition bench, but different from our opening bench, we don't only think that without the process of grief, people wouldn't grow. We also have given more analysis on likelihood, on why this will be better, but we also think that as a society, could collectively understand that grieving is a difficult process better in our side, then we maybe can be more empathetic towards each other, especially towards people who grieving process is different and not socially acceptable in society norm. Like how when my grandpa died last year, my mom still acted very, very fine in front of everyone when each of my family member have been bawling our eyes out. I frown upon her action at that time because I don't see it as a correct form of grief that conformed to the societal norm standard, hence why I judge her. Little did I know she didn't grieve because she wanted to let us have the time to grieve. So yeah, we didn't think that people could ever move on from grief, and that's okay. It might be better, as what my member have explained. Also, OG talked a lot about how it could make the world better because people will evaluate themselves from grief. But we think that the world would be better not just because of that, but be better because of the collective increase of empathy and equal emotional validation from everyone. Moving on to my response for OO. First, OO said that people will still commemorate people even if emotional states subside, right? Because you won't forget them, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I agree that just because you classify it as an emotional state does not mean that you will forget that someone has ever died. That's true. But the biggest question is which house could produce a more ideal world. You could agree that in both houses, no one forget. But as my member have explained, it would still be better in our house since people won't see grief as a state of or as a state to overcome or as a negative thing you should move on, but as something you can value for the rest of your life, as something you can always look back to when there's a life-changing event, as something that could help you build yourself as a better person in the end of the day. Hence why it is more likely for the people in your side to run away from the feeling of grief because of how you paint it as something you can get out of, right? Second, they say that our side long term are shorter than what the long term benefit that they have, right? If you don't process it in shorter time, then you won't be able to function, blah blah blah, right? I feel that this is wrong, exactly because there's a 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. Yes, the first 4 steps could be considered as an emotional state, but there's a reason on why the last step is acceptance and not moving on, because you can never move on from this, because grieving itself is not an emotional state. It's a state of life that from now on, every step you take, you will look back upon the time you were grieving, not completely move away from it, like what Oo said. When you grieve, in order to make they say that when you grieve, in order to make you feel better, you need to have the hope to move on, right? The harsh truth is, you will never move on from grief, neither does the people around you. You will just repress it until there's a song that reminds you of that person, or channels that person, or TV channels that person used to watch. You could never move on from something as impactful as grief. You can only accept that you are grieving, and you forever will be for the rest of your life. What matters is what you're gonna do with it. Will you let it ruin you, or will you learn to live with it? Insinuating that you can run away from it is cruel. It's false hope, because the truth is you can't. So in your side, there's a higher likelihood of people to take the wrong action and attitude towards grief, because you give them a sense of false hope that they can't get away from it. And finally, like even when they're like 30 or 40, they could finally forget, but they couldn't. 4, you say that society will tell you to grieve longer if you don't perceive it as an emotional state. Wrong. How about I give you one better? In our side, people will not tell you to do anything, because no matter what kind of grieving form you will have, it would always be perceived as a lifelong process instead of emotion that will eventually subside. Hence why the impact of grief itself will be higher in our side of the house. Hence why, knowing this, people will be more forgiving towards different form of grief in our side. Response to CO. They say that our side never said that grief is something that you could move on for. We don't think that grief is something you could move on for. They also said that self-blaming would be worse in our side. People who blame themselves for the death of others will be worse in our side. No, self-blaming is mutual in both of our side, because in the end of the day, people still die, and it's still part of 5 stages of grief. But the question is how you will overcome that self-blaming better. Whose side will help you overcome that self-blaming better? Your form of this is by moving on. Tell yourself it's not your fault. Although it might be effective to push this narrative down people's throat, the feeling itself is an intrinsic feeling. No matter how much you tell people that are blaming themselves for someone that it's not their fault, as long as they don't believe that, it won't go away. They have to be the one that believe that for that to go away. But in our side, the feeling of regret will be more manageable, because it's a lifelong process. Understanding that that it is not your fault will be better in our side because of maturity. Because as you grow older, you will never stop processing it, meaning that as you mature, you will understand more that it will be not your fault, and any other kind of negative feeling that comes from grief will be better processed in our side, because it's a lifelong process. Hence why this motion should stand. I love you, Grandpa.
All right, we thank the government whip for those very fine remarks. Just like to note that if people need time, feel free to take as much space as you need, yeah, and feel free to request accommodation should things be needed. But thank you indeed. And finally, to close the debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip to speak. Here.
Can I pronounce your her and trigger warning? Talking about death, and probably it's pretty sensitive to many people inside this room. Grieving is never an emotion that anyone likes inside this world, because to be stuck inside grief is to be constantly reminded of their demise, to always feel sad, because that's how people express grief under Gov Bench's world. A lifelong progress of grief is never a way for you to actually be emotionally attached towards the people who has already passed away, but it's always going to be a traumatic event that actually tries to tell you that you should always remember these people, you should always remember the process and the traumatic events for when they pass away, exactly because that is the only way for you to actually commemorate them under side government, right? I think first of all, let's talk about OG, because I tell you that the lifelong process of grieving makes you feel grief and remember the deceased members. But first of all, I don't think that setup makes any sense, because grief always happens whether you like it or not, because it's always finite that everyone always have a limit inside their life, that people will always have to disease inside their entire life at the end, right? Because everyone in this room has experienced grief at some point, when your loved ones passed away, when your friends suddenly passed away due to an illness, even if you thought they're always going to be there for you. So the feeling of grief is then not just exclusive to OG, but also to everyone inside this entire bench. But how you process it is going to be a better way under CO, exactly because we tell you that there's always going to be a way for you to try to process it better, for you to accept that grief, because you cannot always be stuck inside that one position and inside that one current momentum that you have inside your world. But secondly then, I think the lifelong process of grief doesn't make the value of grief larger on their side as well. Because first of all, grief is always going to be an extreme emotion. When your family passed away, people equally feel sad and deny the fact that your family just passed away. OG cannot take half stance and say that grief is not always going to be that bad, because that is insulting to people who are distracted by the news of your family passing away. You still appreciate your parents because you fear grief for how devastating it is. You fear losing an important member inside your family or the friends that you actually love, because relationship will always be binded with love and not with grief. Therefore, the appreciation that you have for other people will always going to be there. Grief is not actually something that is going to be larger just because you have that lifelong process. But secondly then, I think the subsided emotions doesn't mean you rush people to accept grief, because people will always respond to grief and go through the 5 stages until they accept it as well, because you have to go through a process for you to actually understand what is currently happening inside the world. Why is someone suddenly shifting away from you, for example, exactly because they already passed away. But thirdly, exactly because you know how difficult it is to go through grief, you need a narrative that provides people and guides people to give them comfort for them to actually cope with how their loved ones actually pass away at the end of the day. So comparatively to CO then, there's always going to be discussion to talk about grief and to talk about your loved ones. But how do you process grief? It validates your entire emotion for what you feel when your family passed away, for example. It advises you to move on and advises you to accept, because it is the only way to provide you closure that grief will always be hard, but everything will eventually become okay. So what is the weighing then? I think this in and of itself outs OG, because the perception to grief will always exist, but to live through it is what makes people value it more under CO's role. But also weighs over OO, because we give you the actual process for how we help people move on. That is the biggest empowerment that you actually can provide to people who are currently grieving, because you cannot just tell them that you should always remember the people who actually passed away, because you will always remember them when it is binded by love, but how you actually try to cope with the deceased members that you actually have so much attachment to, that you're unable to function well, for example, as an individual, because you're always going to be stuck inside the position of grieving as well. But why the perception of subsiding emotions help people cope with death and eventually increase the value of memory that you have with the deceased member? Because I think all comes out to this debate by saying that people need to be productive. I think that's true, but they never provide you the coping mechanism or how they actually help people to accept the grief in itself. Because you live in a world that grief can subside if there is actually an encouragement that comes from people surrounding you, for example, for you to actually try to slowly accept grief and then slowly let that emotion state subside. Because I think the internal calculus that you have to believe that you can feel better is most important, because it's the only way for you to support people and to provide one with the closure that your family will eventually, your family has already deceased, and you would have to try to manage your own emotion, for example, right? But secondly then, I think most likely when society believes grief will pass, the accumulated support system that you have will also become way better on our side. Because it looks like how people support you to move on. They share their own experiences of grieving. They guide you to how to slowly walk out of the traumatic scenario, because I think everyone can agree that grieving is never an easy process to begin with. Comparatively to golf bench, right? OG talks about remembering the deceased. CG talks about the appreciation towards the people who has already passed away. Firstly, my members already told you why memory will always exist, because that was attached to individual or emotions and not simply the feelings of grief in and of itself. But secondly then, we directly flip this because memory instead becomes more valuable on the other side of the house. Why? Because only when people subside grief, they can trigger the appreciation and not the feelings of grief when you think about the people that has already passed away, when you think about your family, because you want to make sure that everyone is still living their life. You still remember the happy memories that you have with your grandma, for example, for how she always wants to give you food because she always thinks that you're hungry, and not the fact that everyone is breaking down in front of her funeral. I think exactly because of that, when you look back at your memory with your family, it is then way better for people to actually accept the grief, for you to accept the fact that your family member has already passed away, because that is always going to be something that is inevitable inside this world. But what does it look like? OG.
Even if people will eventually reach acceptance, that will either A, make you stay on one of the 4 stages longer, or B, make you rush through the other stages in an incomplete manner.
I think I already told you how there's always going to be a narrative for you to be guided to how to accept grief, because emotional state to be subsided is always going to be a gradual process that differs for every single people, for example, right? That's the reason why there's always going to be a timeline for people, but the encouragement in and of itself is very important, because it's the only empowerment that you can provide to people who are actually grieving. So on CG, people will always have to be stuck in grief, because it's the only way for you to respect the deceased or to validate your attachment towards them. If nostalgia happened, you get traumatized with it, because it's always about grief. It's always the sad images for when your grandma passed away, when your entire family is actually crying in front of her funeral, because that's how you express grief under their side. But comparatively to CO, because you process your grief and let it subside, then every moment you look back at your memory, you can now feel content and remember how your grandma loves you, for example, or how much your family actually cares about you when you're still inside this world. So what is the weighing then? I think grief is something that is difficult. You can only have a way to accept it or try to accept it if the world tells you, and that there are narratives to encourage you that the emotional state will subside and everything will be okay. I think if we're talking about how hard it is for people to accept grief, and how hard it is for you to accept the fact that your family will never be here again for you inside this world, is for you to have that narrative to tell you emotions will subside, is the only way for you to cope with your emotions and the only way for you to appreciate them more under CO's world. Opposed. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Opposition Whip. Thank you very much, everyone. And that is the end of the semifinal round debate. So please give a round of applause for everyone. The results will be announced later on in the main hall. I would like to ask specifically, because of the nature of the motion and because of the nature of the conversation that we just had, if you really need some time, please do take them. I really recommend that. It's really, really crucial just to have a bit of space for yourself as well as you as a team. It is quite important to do so. And I hope everyone's okay. And if you're not, feel free to chat. Yeah, more than happy as well, just in terms of, because these emotions are, yeah, not the easiest one as well. Yeah. All right. We'll talk later, but yeah, thank you very much.